of what sociology as a science should be. We'll see. This was written 1897, and ever since then, it's enjoyed both. It's certainly enjoyed a great deal of importance. It has been criticized later for various reasons. We'll look at what the problems might be with this particular position that Durkheim is adopting. We'll look at this in detail as we get into his text. We will be reading the first 3 chapters. So let's turn to Durkheim. I'll just right. So Émile Durkheim, he was born in an Orthodox Jewish family, but he himself became a non-believer. He did not remain a practicing Jew. He was educated at the École Normale Supérieure, which is one of the most famous institutions of education in Paris. And then he went on to teach for a short time in Bordeaux, and then at the Sorbonne in Paris. And as I've just said, he's considered one of the founders of modern sociology. His main works, his first main work was The Division of Labor. We won't go into the details of this, but in a sense, we've already encountered the concept of division of labor in Adam Smith. But Durkheim's argument or Durkheim's approach was not simply to look at the conceptual side of division of labor in relation to economic production, which is really what Smith was looking at. He looked at the actual institutions, that is to say, the different occupations, the emergence of occupations, the obsolescence of particular occupations, the professional organization of particular occupations, and so on, in France mainly, but in a larger scale in Europe, as his main point of study. And as we'll see, one of the main arguments that Durkheim will make in this set of introductory texts called The Rules of Sociological Method, one of the key arguments of Durkheim is to claim that sociology must not try to deal entirely with concepts. It has to look at facts on the ground. And he emphasized this a number of times, as we've seen. So Division of Labor was his first major work. The Rules of Sociological Method come later. Then another very important book in the history of sociology called Suicide. We'll again look at the main arguments that, or the main approach that Durkheim would adopt in that particular book, 1897. The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, which was his last major work, we'll be reading from that book in a couple of weeks when we return to Durkheim. In some ways, that's his most, might say, most influential book. The preface to the rules, which you have seen, this was circulated. This was actually the preface to the second edition which was published in 1901, and in which you would have noticed he responds to some criticisms that were made of his main arguments in the rules. Now, what was Durkheim trying to do here? He was keen to establish sociology as a science in the 19th century sense of the natural science. So, what he was trying to work out was a set of methodological rules that would follow the methods of inquiry in the natural sciences. And the way in which the natural sciences had advanced in trying to discover the basic phenomena, the basic processes in the natural world, and the successes that the natural sciences had achieved. This is what Durkheim was attempting to do in the world of social relations, of human relations. So he was very clear that sociology had to become a science. And what would be the rules of method that must be followed for sociology to emerge as a science? This is his main project. Now, what would that entail? What would that mean? He believed in an external world that has unchanging laws. This is what the natural sciences, in the deterministic sense, the, let's say, post-Newton, Newtonian physics, for instance. The whole understanding was that the external world, the world that is outside outside human consciousness, outside human perception, that external world has unchanging laws, that they were created in a certain way, whoever may have been the creator. And some scientists continue to believe in a creator God who created the world. There were many other scientists who did not believe that there was some entity called God who created the world. But whatever it was, the world had been created, had come to exist. But having come to exist, it followed certain inherent natural laws, which were unchanging, right? And so I've pointed this out earlier in, I forget which particular lecture, when we were talking of deism. And deism was a particular variety of Christian doctrine, in which the argument was to accept the Christian belief in a creator God, but then to make the following argument that having created the world, the creator God does not interfere in that creation. In other words, what that rules out is the possibility of miracles. God will not interfere in this world, will not intervene and produce something which is out of the ordinary, which is not what the normal, natural course of events are. God will not do any such thing. Because as you can well see, that if it was possible for some outside force, such as a divine force, to interfere in natural processes, then of course you could never have a proper natural science, because there would be no unchanging natural laws. Natural laws would be subject to the intervention of some divine entity, right? There would be miracles, for instance. The foundations of modern science, one of the foundations of modern science, was to eliminate the possibility of miracles. The natural world was entirely outside of our consciousness. And in fact, the argument would be made once the ideas of human evolution, etc., had emerged in the 19th century, that the world, natural world, existed in this form long before human beings were created, before human beings arrived in this world. The world was there, and that world had natural laws, and everything had evolved if they had changed. They had evolved according to natural laws, right? So change itself follows a law-like pattern. So this was the whole understanding of the physical sciences. And Durkheim was very insistent that that is the model that had to be followed by a sociology trying to understand the laws of society. Okay, so just as in the natural world, there has been this emergence of different scientific disciplines, each scientific discipline with its own special object of study and its own appropriate method. So chemistry and physics and biology and geology and so on, each had its own special object of study. It had defined which part of the natural world it would study, and then devised appropriate methods for that particular field. The same must apply to sociology. Sociology too must define its own field and then devise its own methods for studying that particular field. So this is the initial statement of the project. This is what Durkheim was out to do. Now, here, one of the key concepts that Durkheim would propose was that of the social fact. We'll see what he meant by the social fact. But just as the natural world is outside the individual consciousness of the scientist, right? The scientist, when studying the natural world, let's say studying the physical world, right? Laws of motion, or studying the way in which various substances, chemical substances, interact with one another, right? Or the way in which biological organisms function. The individual scientist is outside that process. The individual scientist places himself or herself outside that process and studies it from a distance, separated from that process. So when the scientist is studying some natural phenomenon outside in the real world or in a laboratory, in an artificially constructed situation in a laboratory, in both of these cases, the scientist tries to adopt a position which is outside that process, so that that process can be observed. This is what would be called objectivity. We'll come to that in a minute. That would be what's called objectivity. In other words, the argument is that the observation of a natural process, of an external process, must not be dependent, must not be conditioned by any subjective emotions, sentiments, any of those kinds of things, right? There must be nothing subjective, so that, in fact, this is one of the premises of what we now call the classical natural sciences. The premises was that whenever these observations are made, they must be made in a way that any other person observing those same phenomena would actually observe exactly the same thing, right? This is the whole point of, let us say, scientific observations which are reported reported in a paper published in a scientific journal, for instance. Observations that are made in a laboratory situation. The whole point was that they must be reported in a way that that same experiment or that same observation can be repeated by others and verified. It's only after a series of verifications of this kind that a particular discovery, a particular law, a particular theory is said to be acceptable, right? It is accepted in the discipline. So all of this is in the background. All of this is what Durkheim is trying to achieve for sociology as a scientific discipline. Okay, and this is how he defines something that he calls social facts. That is what sociologists must find out. What are the social facts? Now, what are social facts? They are, first of all, they are outside of the individual consciousness, out there somewhere. Even though, mind you, there is a particular peculiarity about observing social relations, right, which does not necessarily occur with the physical world. Those sociologists who are studying society are themselves part of society, right? So this has to be taken into account. In a way, therefore, the whole methodological problem is how is the sociologist to separate herself or himself from the society that is being studied, right? That separation must be made, which will establish objectivity. This is what Durkheim is trying to do. So, facts, social facts, exercise coercive or constraining powers over individuals, right? Facts are things, in fact, I've just used a word which Durkheim would use. Facts are things. Facts are things that are of a kind that not only do they lie outside of individual consciousness, they actually constrain or exert a force, a pressure over individuals, right? And these take the form of social norms. We will see how norms emerge. These social norms offer resistance to individual attempts to ignore or oppose these facts. Okay? So facts are things that exist independently of the individuals who constitute a society. This is the most important claim that Durkheim is making, that even though we think of individuals as acting according to their will, right? I go out and I want to go to this place, or I want to do this thing, right? Or I want to say this, okay? Or I want to eat a particular kind of meal, right? I want to meet such and such person or such and such a group of people. All of these we think we can do as at will. What Durkheim is suggesting is that there are social norms which are facts. And these norms actually will exert a constraint or a pressure on me so that I do not actually end up acting entirely according to my will. I will do whatever I want to do, but following certain norms, following certain rules. These are rules that have been laid down by social institutions, right? And these will occur in the form of social facts. They are like things. Just as, for instance, the natural world consists of things, right? Forces that I simply cannot ignore. I can't say I'll jump off the roof and fly to the next star or something. It will not happen. I will unfortunately fall to the ground. It is of that kind. And we'll see what kind of norms these are, what happens when norms are violated, right? Why are these facts? Now, why is this not something that might be included within the natural science? They can't, because these are not biological or psychical constraints, right? These are constraints. So some of these, there are biological constraints, right? I cannot say that I will lift this particular mountain, because biologically it's impossible. I do not have the strength for it, right? That's a biological constraint. I cannot violate. There are lots of other reasons why, things that I might want to do, but biologically, given my physical condition and my physical abilities, I am unable to do them. Those are biological constraints. There are psychical constraints, right? Why various things are beyond my ability. Similarly, but not included within those. Similarly, Durkheim is suggesting there are social constraints. Social constraints. These are social facts, which the sociologist must discover. Okay? Now, social facts are beliefs, tendencies, and practices of a group taken collectively. Now, this is an important point that he's making. What constrains an individual is an entire body of beliefs, tendencies, and practices of the group, or the social group, the social community of which an individual is a part. Okay, and those beliefs and tendencies or those practices are held collectively. So these are not just random individual beliefs or individual practices. These are practices that are followed by the group collectively. And those are social facts. Okay, now, how do individuals come to know of these norms, and how are they constrained or compelled to follow them? Through education. This is the function of education in society, which sociologists would then call socialization, right? Socialization. That is to say, being made part of society. So from infancy through childhood, every child is socialized in this way. This is how you must speak. This is how you must behave with others, right? This is how you must dress. This is how you must eat. And from that, almost an entire set of things that a human being has to do in life, they become part of certain kinds of normativized, right? We'll see, there's a very important concept of normality, which Durkheim will come to in a minute. We will come to it very soon. So social norms become known and accepted through socialization, right? In the family, in the social group, through institutions such as the school, right? And of course, in modern societies, there are a whole range of other institutions, including the institutions of amusement, and, all of those kinds of institutions, media, etc. That's how norms become known and accepted. And here, Durkheim actually moves to his central methodological proposition that even though many of these norms are in fact transmitted in the forms of, let us say, stories, narratives, literature, okay, instructional media of different kinds, lessons in morality, all of those kinds of things are important in the socialization, right? But not all of these are necessarily the material for science, because they are not necessarily precise. Okay. Now, this is where the methodological thrust actually comes in Durkheim. He is trying to find material of a kind that the scientist uses in a laboratory. Okay, so why is it, for instance, that when studying, let us say the behavior, let us say why iron will rust, something like that. This is a normal phenomenon that we find in daily life. But to find the precise scientific reason for this, okay, the scientist will have to devise in a laboratory or in some kind of laboratory-like situation, replicate this process by which a piece of iron which is not rusted actually comes to acquire this rust. And in order to do this, the scientist has to isolate specific elements that the scientist thinks are responsible for this process of rusting and bring them together artificially in a laboratory-like situation, carry out experiments, and then come to a definitive conclusion. This is the specific way in which these elements, A, B, C, whatever, they come together under these conditions in order to produce this effect of rusting on the iron. Now, Durkheim wants to do exactly that sort of inquiry into social matter, right? And so, even though, let us say, things like marriages or the preservation of one's health, okay, these are all standard things that all societies actually teach their children over time, right? How these institutions and these practices are to be carried out in a variety of forms, through a variety of means, including, as I said, folk tales to literature of different kinds, through art, etc., etc., music, all sorts of things can be employed and are employed, but they don't actually produce, or they don't actually give to the scientists, in this case, the sociologists, sufficiently precise facts. These facts are much better expressed in the form of statistics. The statistical fact, which expresses the state of the collective mind much better, and these become particularly useful for the sociologists. So, for instance, we'll come to the question of suicide. And let's take that example, because that's something on which Durkheim would later actually write a whole book. Now, suicides. If you take the individual suicide, one can think of a whole range of reasons why a particular person might decide that life is not worth living anymore, and therefore he or she takes the decision to commit suicide. And these could be a whole range of things. It could be some kind of economic disaster, a massive debt, for instance, or the fact that one is unable to find a livelihood, or, for instance, there is some failed love affair. You know, whole set of reasons we can think of, individual reasons why a person commits suicide. But those are not collective facts. This is important. Those are not collective facts. If one was to study suicide as some kind of collective phenomenon that characterizes a society, right? What would be the data? And there, these individual varieties of suicide with an enormous range of, causes is of no use. There, what is much more useful for sociological analysis is something like a rate of suicide, an annual rate of suicide in a particular area, geographical area, perhaps among a particular section of the population, right? The changes in that rate over time, or comparisons between that rate in one place compared to another place, those variations are much more amenable to sociological analysis, causal analysis, right? Because that would explain in what way one society or a society at a particular point of time, right, has, what that society has to do, or that structure or the condition of that society has to do with the collective phenomenon of suicide, right? We will come to this just a little bit later when we look at, suicide rates in different places and the enormous differences there. And that is obviously something a sociologist would say, well, this has to be explained. Why is the suicide rate so low in one country or in a city compared to another? Right? We'll come to this. And this was, in fact, a very major part of Durkheim's own study of suicide, where he looked at suicide rates. And again, data is very important there. We'll come to this in a minute. He compared suicide rates in Paris and London based on police records, because suicides were reported to the police, and the police would keep records. And so he looked at these records over a period of time in these two cities. And that is the kind of fact, social fact, that Durkheim said is necessary for sociology as a scientific discipline to become possible. Right? Any questions? Now, a social fact is a way of acting that exists independently of its individual manifestations and is capable of exerting an external constraint over the individual. Now, an external constraint. So let's continue with the example of suicides. Individual suicides, as I said, can have a whole range of different causes, right? One cause is not the same as another. So therefore, each individual case of suicide is different. In that sense, each individual suicide is not a social fact because they are not collective facts. The collective fact would be the rate of suicide. A rate of suicide. Let's say the number of suicides in a year per 100,000 of the population. That's sort of the standard way, 10,000, 100,000 of the population. So how many out of a population of 100,000 would commit suicide in a year? Now, why is Durkheim saying that if there is a social fact of this kind, it would exert an external constraint over the individual? It would if it turned out that, let us say, the suicide rate in a particular city, let us say Paris or London, right, remains more or less the same every year. This is what Durkheim found out. This is what he discovered. That even though individual suicides have to be explained by a whole range, a whole variety of causes, right? One suicide was not like another suicide. So therefore, just looking at individual cases, it would seem that, suicide, there is no collective phenomenon here. Suicides are entirely matters of individual psychological or other maybe biological explanation, right? There's no collective social phenomenon involved here. But then looking at the suicide rates in the cities of Paris and London over a period of, I think he looked at something like 30 or 40 years of data that was available with the police, he discovered that irrespective of the individual variety, more or less the same number of people committed suicide every year in Paris or in London. That number, that average rate in a year, that did not vary a great deal, only minor variations. And this, Durkheim says, requires a different kind of explanation. How is it possible that even though individual causes of suicide can be so different, one case to the other, how is it possible that every year, more or less the same number of people in a particular city would commit suicide? His argument was that this is a collective social fact. It's a collective social fact. That is to say, there is something in the social conditions of living in that city, right, which exerts a certain kind of external constraint on the behavior of individuals, so that they obviously don't know that they're acting in, individuals don't know that they're acting in conformity with some sociological rule, right? But it just so happens, just as in the natural world, these external constraints operate in that way, according to natural laws. This too was like a sociological law, a law-like feature of society, that the suicide rate every year would be roughly so much in a particular city. And that is because Durkheim suggested that those broader constraints of society, it could be the economy, it could be the, let's say, education structures, it could be the family structures, right? It could be, as I said, economic opportunities. All of those things are possible. It could be medical treatment, etc., that may or may not be available. Or it could be the means by which, the availability of the means by which people commit suicide. All of those things are more or less constant throughout. Those being constant, the number of people committing suicide every year would also be more or less the same. This is Durkheim's main argument, that you have to find those underlying social, institutional conditions which may determine not individual suicides, they determine this collective rate of suicide. Now, the interesting thing here is that a statistical fact is, of course, completely an abstract construction. There is nothing out there which says, you know, when you say that, let us say there are every year in the city of Calcutta, supposing 150 people commit suicide, right? 150 is a number which is statistically computed from individual cases that are reported every year, right? The individual cases are cases of actual human beings who take their own lives, right? Those are actual human beings who are suicide cases. But the rate of suicide, there is nothing out there in the social world, right, which you can point to and say that's the rate of suicide. The rate of suicide is a purely abstract construction. So, and yet this is what Durkheim is insisting, that this abstract construction of a sociological fact, which exists outside of human consciousness, is in fact a thing. It is a thing in the same way that the force of gravity is a thing, right? This is what Durkheim is suggesting. So a social fact is a way of acting that exists independently of its individual manifestations and is capable of exerting an external constraint over the individual. So be careful to note what the claim is, right? Durkheim is not saying that when an individual sadly decides to commit suicide, that person does not have any of this in his or her head, right? That person is thinking of completely different things, which have to do, as I said, with his or her mental condition, emotions. All of those kinds of things may be operational there. But independently of those individual considerations, there is an external constraint, right, which operates. And this operates over the group collectively, not on individuals, over the group collectively, such that you will find the consequence of a certain number of people, more or less the same number of people, committing suicide every year. And that is what needs to be explained. What are those social constraints which operate collectively? Right? So that's what Durkheim is calling social facts, which the sociologist must discover. Social facts are structural, relating to the social substratum. This is what he's calling substratum, sort of base-like thing, right? Uh, social facts can be observed. This is, again, a very interesting methodological suggestion that Durkheim is proposing. Social facts can be observed from the resistance of society to individual attempts to oppose them, as with law, morality, or customs. Or they can be observed from their general prevalence outside individual consciousness, as with economic facts. So take the second of this. How do you observe social facts? You can observe them from their general prevalence outside individual consciousness. I've just explained something like the rate of suicide, which you can observe from the data on suicides that may be computed officially every year, right? Or with a whole range of economic facts, the rate of employment or unemployment, the cost of living, those kinds of things, which, again, they are outside of individual consciousness. They operate in society at large, as it were, but they can be observed from their general prevalence. There is a prevailing price level. There is a prevailing scale of employment or unemployment, right? And if you devise methods by which you can count more or less reliably what these numbers are statistically, then you construct a fact. You construct the fact which operates outside of individual consciousness as a constraint on individual behavior, on human behavior. So the rate of unemployment will act as an outside, it's a constraint. So you simply can't say, I'll go out and find a job. It depends on what the opportunities are. And the opportunities can be observed. What those opportunities are can be observed from studying something like the rate of employment, or similarly, the cost of living index, or something like that. These are all constructed statistical facts, by the way. But there is another kind of social fact which can be observed from the way in which society resists attempts by individuals to oppose those facts or norms. So, rules of morality, right? That, for instance, something like the idea that one must not steal the property of somebody else, right? Many societies actually have laws, codified laws. Even if they don't, there are moral laws against it, against theft. And there are prevailing notions of what counts as theft and what doesn't count as theft. But if someone violates that norm, society resists through punishment. We'll come to this in a minute. Through punishment. And so if you observe, if the sociologist observes how or on what occasions and in what forms society resists individual choices or individual actions because they are supposed to violate some kind of collective norm, then you have a possible observation of a social fact. So you can find out something like crime rates or the nature of crime in a particular society by observing, as Durkheim would say, how do you find out crime? Look at punishment. What are the punishments? And what is punished? What is punished is a crime in that society. Uh, Customs, for instance, things like what dress to wear, right? On which occasions. There are customary rules, and if somebody opposes or violates those customary rules, then there are different ways in which society will oppose or punish that violation. And so, from an outside standpoint, you can find out what the rules are of dress or etiquette in a particular society by looking at what is frowned upon, uh, what is resisted, right? What is not allowed, prohibited, etc. So these are the two ways in which you can observe social facts. Now, this is the central claim that Durkheim would make. Social facts are things. Consider social facts as things in the same way that you have natural objects, things, right? A stone, a mountain, a tree, these are things. In the same way, consider social facts as things. Reflective thought, which proceeds by logical deduction from analysis, cannot give objective results. Now, this is a very key argument that Durkheim is making in order to define a new field of sociology. He's not denying that there is something called social fact, that all societies have in fact thought about the structures, the rules, the processes, etc., by which that society functions or should function, right? And they have described these, and they transmit this from generation to generation in a variety of forms. But much of this is through ideas or concepts. Ideas or concepts, okay? By logical deductions from assumptions. So the argument would be, let us say, that society must be harmonious, or peace must be maintained in society. What is most required in social life is peace and security. For this reason, let us say the argument might be, what you really need is a strong, powerful state, a ruler who will lay down the rules. And if those rules are violated, that ruler will punish. Now, that's one kind of construction. And a great deal of what would be called political thought, social thought, is based on arguments of this kind, especially if you think of the Western tradition. A lot of the thinking actually proceeds exactly like this, particularly modern social thought. Whether you think of somebody like Hobbes or somebody like Rousseau, all of these people actually proceed by, in fact, a very standard procedure was to imagine some kind of state before society emerges, right? A state of, which is often called a state of nature, where there are no institutions, no laws, right? What was human life like in that kind of society? So there is a description. Now, this description is an assumption. And then the argument is, if that was the original state, the state of nature, what would be the condition in that state of nature? And the argument would be that something would go wrong, that this turned out not to be a very desirable state of things. And so social institutions were constructed. various social institutions were constructed. You could have, you also had other ways of thinking. For instance, the argument that it was God or some creator who created human beings and created the rules, right? And so these institutions and laws that we have were in fact made by God. And if they were made by God, and we have come to know them, that they were made by God through a prophet or whatever it was, or you maybe they are written down in scriptural texts. That is what must be followed. That's another kind of logical deduction from concepts. Now, what Durkheim is claiming that social thought or sociology so far, whatever social thought exists, has thus far dealt with concepts, not things. Right? They have dealt with concepts. They did not go out and look for social facts on the ground. What is it like at this point in this society? That is not how they proceeded. They dealt with concepts, not things. Large concepts, such as the state, or freedom, or democracy, and so on, are not sufficiently known as things. Hence, ideology has come to prevail over science. So the position is being argued very clearly by Durkheim. What we have in social thought so far is a body of contending ideologies, right? And these ideologies come out of conflicting assumptions about some kind of initial state of nature, right? And the conceptual deductions from that initial set of assumptions. There are differences over how to deduce and what to deduce, and they have resulted in a set of ideologically distinct sets of social theories, right? But this was not science. This is not science because none of these kinds of theories or ideas or concepts actually went out to look for actual facts of social life as they existed on the ground, right? This is what must be done for sociology as a science to come into existence. So science must establish what is, not what to be. We must get inductively verified results from data, right? Treat things, facts as data. So this is absolutely a new agenda that Durkheim is proposing. Get rid of the kinds of social thinking that has proceeded from certain ideological assumptions about what would be a good society to be achieved in the future, right? And Durkheim talks about this. It could be some kind of society where there is absolute freedom of individuals, or some kind of society of socialism, for instance, where there is no want, no scarcity, or there is some distribution which is where everyone has equal opportunities, etc., etc. You have all of these kinds of desirable goals which are stated ideologically, and those goals are decided on the basis of concepts. Durkheim is claiming that sociology as a science must have nothing to do with this kind of thinking, right? What ought to be is leave it to politicians and or whoever else. Science, or the science of sociology, must establish what is. It must get inductively verified results from data. And so treat social facts as data. Questions? Now, the conventional character of a practice or institution must not be assumed in advance. So, when you confront an institution, let us say family or marriage, okay, do not assume in advance what the purpose of the family is. Why is it conventional? Why is a particular form of marriage conventional? Do not assume that conventional character in advance. You have to go out and actually look at the facts, discover the facts. Discover the facts, right? So sociology is discovery, not interpretation. It is discovery. You have to discover the facts. A thing or a social fact cannot be modified by a mere act of the will. So changing social facts requires arduous effort at changing institutions and practices. Okay, so for instance, thinking about the conventional, do not assume, for instance, let us say, look at marriage. And if you look at India today, and you look at, let us say, the legal definitions of marriage, right? Then according to the legal definitions of marriage, as far as Hindu marriages are concerned, the rule is monogamy, right? Polygamy is legally not allowed. Okay. On the other hand, for Muslim marriages, polygamy is allowed. Now, what Durkheim is saying, simply because these are the institutional rules as defined by law, do not assume in advance that those are the facts. Do not assume in advance that those are the facts. Because if you actually look at the facts on the ground, you will discover, as in fact sociologists have discovered, right, that among Hindu males, the prevalence of having more than one wife is quite common. Lots of Hindu men actually do have more than one wife right now, even though by law it is not supposed to be allowed. And it is also true that the overwhelming majority of Muslim men do not have more than one wife. That monogamy is most certainly the average position in Muslim society. That even though the law allows it, the actual prevalence of polygamy is quite exceptional. A very small proportion actually practice it. So that you would not know unless you actually went out and devised methods by which you can discover those facts. And of course, in Durkheim's time, for instance, the whole idea of doing survey research and so on was only beginning. It was it was not well developed at all. Durkheim doesn't talk about survey research very much. That is a 20th century discovery. The survey research, house-to-house survey, sample surveys, sample household surveys, these are all things that were devised in more or less the middle of the 20th century in different parts of the world. And so many of these things are now standard procedures in sociology. Anybody who has studied sociology in undergraduate or postgraduate levels would know how to do these things. This was not true in Durkheim's time, but Durkheim was insisting that methods must be found to discover, and he kept insisting on this word, discover. These facts are not there transparent. You cannot assume them in advance, right? You have to actually go out there and find out. So, and what follows in Durkheim's argument is that these facts do not change at will, right? And we'll come to this very soon, that, for instance, even by changing the law, you cannot necessarily change practices that easily. You may change the law, but practices will not necessarily change that quickly. So, for instance, if you think of something like child marriage in India, right? There is a law, and that law has been in place for quite some time, which actually outlaws child marriage. Child marriages are not supposed to take place by law. And yet, sociologists have found that child marriages take place, not only do they take place among certain sections of the population, they may even be said to be the prevalent practice, right? That girls, for instance, get married at the age of 15 or 16. That is perfectly, you might say, normal among particular sections and in particular regions of the country. So this is what Durkheim is pointing out, that changing social facts requires arduous effort at changing institutions and practices. Now we will remember this, Durkheim's position, because in a sense, this is somewhat different from the kind of method that Max Weber would suggest later on, that of interpretive sociology. Sociology as interpretation of facts rather than discovery of facts. We will postpone that discussion for the moment, because when we come to Weber, we can discuss this more fully. But Durkheim's position is very clear here, that what sociology must do is discover the facts. So how does one proceed to discover facts? Begin by defining things as a function, as their inherent property. In other words, ask the question, why does this practice exist? Why is it there? What function does it perform? Discard all preconceptions. Begin with immediate, visible, and common external characteristics. Now, in a sense, this is exactly the same as what Marx had suggested when dealing with commodities. In other words, when Marx embarked on the exercise of analyzing capitalist production, he said that we must begin with commodities, because that is the most immediate, visible, and common external characteristic of capitalist society. What do you see? How do you identify a capitalist society? You identify it by the vast array of commodities that are available there for sale, right? So start there. Durkheim is more or less saying the same thing. Take the most immediate, unmediated observations, and then form, and this is interesting, form fresh concepts de novo to explain things. Don't necessarily go by conventional concepts, right? Don't depend on the concept which the society itself uses. Form fresh concepts de novo. All of that is, in a sense, to establish precisely that element of distance from what is being observed. Don't observe it as an insider. Observe it as an outsider. And in order to do that, do not get inside the conceptual world by which people in that society operate. Right? Distance yourself. Look at only that which appears in the most immediate form, unmediated form. People who are inside the society are already thinking in ways that have been mediated by education, etc., etc. All of that has been in operation. So when you ask them, let us say, about marriage, for instance, in Hindu society, you ask insiders, they will give an account of marriage which is mediated by a whole range of, let us say, Dharma Shastra texts, by concepts that are derived from the Varna Jati system, etc., etc., but abstracted, not necessarily as things happen on the ground. We'll come to this when we'll give you the example of how caste has been studied in the Indian situation, right? It began precisely by taking the description that had been given by the theorized view from the inside, which is the Dharma Shastra view, right? Where there is a Varna order and all the jatis are supposed to be organized within that Varna order. And a lot of the early sort of sociological accounts of in the Indian caste system proceeded from that textual, conceptual description as provided in the Varna Shastra, in the Dharma Shastra texts. But then a new generation of sociologists said we have to go to the village, actual villages, and look at how caste actually operates on the ground. And so you had these whole set of village studies, particularly from the 1950s onwards. And then it was discovered that the actual caste relations or caste structures at the village level sometimes had no relation at all to the Dharma Shastra descriptions. The Varna order very often was irrelevant in the ways in which the jatis were structured. There were hierarchies, right? But the hierarchies very often differed from one place to another. Certainly, regional caste structures in India are very different one from the other. And this is what Durkheim would say, well, you are discovering social facts as things, because this you would not have got if you had simply followed the preconceptions. Okay? And for that, you have to find fresh concepts. So for regional caste structures, etc., for instance, the present sociological understanding of jati, which is a much more localized concept, is not the same as the Dharma Shastra understanding of jati. Right? So form fresh concepts de novo to explain things. He takes the example of crime. We'll just come to it in a minute. How functional explanation is. Functional is a very interesting argument. We will see why there are problems with the functional explanation. But let us first understand what Durkheim's position is. Facts are fixed features of the social structure that exist permanently. This is again one of his persistent arguments, that facts reflect certain enduring social structures which do change, but they change very slowly, right? For any society in a given period of time, there are enduring or permanent features of the social structure. And this is what you must discover, the sociologist must discover, in order to explain what is going on in that society, explain the facts of society. And for that, a functional explanation is the basic approach, which is to say, try and understand why this particular institution or this particular practice is in place and has endured for so long. Okay, what is its function? That is what you must discover. Now, different societies, for instance, take the example of the family. Different societies have different descriptions of the family, right? What is a family? A family in, let's say, a society of Bushmen in the Kalahari, or and a society and a family in the United States, or a family in Japan. They are not necessarily the same, right? They mean different things. Different practices are observed, different rules of marriage, and so on and so forth. All of that is possible. Some societies have clans, which are not quite what we understand as family. They are, you could say, extended families, but larger kin structures. All right? Observing them as facts will yield a more general concept of kinship. So families become part of a more general concept of kinship, of which each of these families will become a particular type. That is how concepts are refined. So you proceed, for instance, from the immediate description of a family in a particular society. There are other sociologists who are studying other societies, who are also doing the same thing. Put them all side by side within a larger disciplinary framework, and you will find different descriptions of the family. But then somebody will discover a more refined concept, a new concept of kinship, defined in a particular way, so that all of these different kinds of families will then become particular cases of that larger concept of kinship. That is how the discipline grows or develops, right? By refining concepts. This can happen only if a large body of facts from different societies at different periods of time are assembled and compared, placed side by side, and then more refined and more general concepts will begin to emerge. This is essentially, Durkheim is suggesting, follow the method and follow the course of development of the natural sciences. That's how the natural sciences have developed. So such types may also be shown to evolve over time. So the question of change. It is an error to think that savages have no sense of morality. They just have a different sense of morality. which is consistent with their society. What Durkheim is suggesting is that the reason why a lot of early travelers and ethnographers and so on very often described so-called primitive society and primitive peoples as not having a sense of morality. And that is because they were using their own sense of morality and imposing it on that other society. Okay? But there is possibly, and Durkheim is clearly favoring a certain evolutionary idea, stages of society. So primitive society is in a different stage of development. They too have a sense of morality. All societies have a sense of morality. But their sense of morality is different because given their social structure, their, let us say, forms of livelihood, right? And a whole range of economic, other kinds of conditions, right? The function of morality or moral rules are different. They require moral rules that the individual members in that society would follow. Those rules would be framed differently because the functions of rules are different. When studying the family, now this is an interesting question. When studying the family, it is better to start with legal conventions. What he's suggesting is look at the most immediate phenomenon. So when you look at the family in a particular society, look at what the rules are, the laws, legal conventions, which are objective rather than subjective observations, right? The laws are likely to be objective because there will be an agreement in that society to say, yes, these are the rules. Now, there's always a question of whether those rules are actually followed or not. That's another matter. But the rules are there and begin there. And as I said, the sociological study of caste in India began with the Dharmashastra texts and later moved to village study. Right? The Dharmashastra texts were the legal convention, and the understanding was that that would give an objective description of the institution of caste. Any questions so far in terms of the method that Durkheim is proposing? Then we'll come to another important set of things that Durkheim will say about sociology's task, which is to distinguish between the normal and the pathological. We'll come to that in a minute. Any questions so far? Okay, then let me move to the final set of points that Durkheim is making. The distinction between the normal and the pathological. For instance, one of the things that he's suggesting, sickness, is a normal social phenomenon. It cannot be eliminated entirely and may not even be good to eliminate. Now, why is he saying this? Because what the normal means is that which is the average, the most common, right? The most prevalent. And in every society, sickness is something which is common. Every individual has spells of illness, right? It is normal to fall sick. That itself is not pathological. Society cannot eliminate sickness altogether. These are very interesting claims that Durkheim is making, because in a sense, it seems to go against our understanding. Because we, of course, tend to think of sickness as something that we should avoid, right? What Durkheim is suggesting is that it is not possible for society to eliminate sickness altogether, right? Just as crime is another thing that he will discuss. It is not possible for society to eliminate crime altogether. In fact, he will make the further and more and even stronger claim that it is not actually desirable to eliminate sickness altogether, to try to eliminate sickness, or to try to eliminate all crime. And we'll see why he's saying this. Now, this is different from Weber's ideal type. We'll look at this later on, but keep this in mind, because Weber's ideal type is a different way of proceeding. Weber would say, define a concept in its purest form and define a type which is the ideal. You will not find the ideal anywhere in real society. But the ideal is the standard of interpretation against which you will find many different forms of actual cases, which will conform to different degrees to that ideal. And that way you can interpret a society's functioning, okay? Whether it functions, to what extent it functions according to its ideal set of premises. Now, this is a different kind of interpretive sociology, which is distinct from what Durkheim is trying to do, which is actually not. He's specifically saying, do not define these kinds of ideal concepts and try to look for those concepts or those ideal types in the real world, right? That will lead you into error. You will not discover facts. You will be driven by ideological consideration. What he is suggesting is, look at what is the most prevalent form, the average type. Average. The average is the normal. Each species or each society has its own peculiar average type. So the distinction is between the average type in Durkheim and the ideal type in Weber. We will look at Weber's ideal type in greater detail later. What Durkheim is saying, the peculiar average type, that is the social fact. The example of suicide again. The suicide rate is a social fact. The individual suicide is not a social fact. The individual suicide is not an average type. It is an individual case. And there can be a whole series of very specific individual reasons for a person to commit suicide. That is not what the sociologist is out to explain. That can be a subject for, let's say, a clinical psychologist to look at. But the sociologist's subject matter is the social average. So the social rate, if the suicide rate rises or falls, if the suicide rate at one place is significantly different from the suicide rate at another place, those are the facts that a sociologist must go out and explain. Why is the suicide rate different at this place from the other place? Or why is the suicide rate going up or falling in a particular place? Those are the questions, the proper questions for sociology. Also, there is the phenomenon of the pathological. So if there is a normal, there is also a pathological, and the pathological is a marked deviation from the average or normal. Sickness, and if it's sickness, it's a morbidity rate. So clearly, for instance, if you think of a period like something like the COVID epidemic, right? There is clearly a deviation from the normal sickness rates, the facts of sickness. An epidemic situation is not normal. That is a pathological situation. And of course, it could raise a whole series of questions that even a sociologist would be compelled to answer. But that the pathological is clearly defined in terms of a deviation from the normal. Okay? Suicide rates. Now, these are suicide rates. This is not from Durkheim's time, this is much more recent, 2011. So per lakh, per 100,000. Look at the difference. So Lithuania and South Korea, clearly very high. 31 every year annually. 31 suicides for 100,000. Japan, 23. United States is much lower, 12. The average suicide rate in New York City is only 0.5. So clearly the question emerges for the sociologists. Why are the rates so different? And the explanations will not be in terms of individual, trying to explain an individual case, right? Because the individual reasons may well be exactly the same in New York as in Lithuania, any particular individual case. What has to be explained is this collective rate, right? And there the interesting questions will be, or maybe, I'm not proceeding to trying to explain why these differences exist. They may even have to do with things like the prevailing understanding of individual responses as norm, the average response of people to particular situations of suffering of different kinds, right? And it is possible that in one place, the response is not necessarily suicide, but something else. There may well be the same kind of suffering, but the response to that suffering collectively, on the average, in large numbers, right, is something else. It could be, states of mental illness of different kinds with which people continue to live. It is possible that that's what happened. Or it could lead to, it's not necessarily suicide, but violence against others, which is also possible from the same sort of social conditions. But the sociologist's inquiry must be on these broader constraints and the average responses of people to these kinds of constraints, which presumably lead to suicide. Why are those constraints different in different countries or different places? That is a legitimate question that the sociologist can answer. This is what Durkheim is suggesting. But note particularly that the fact that has to be explained is the suicide rate. Okay? And the suicide rate is itself an artificially constructed thing. It is not a natural thing. It is a constructed thing because it is, after all, a statistical fact. Right? But that statistical fact can become an object of sociological explanation. The most widespread forms are the most advantageous in the aggregate. So he's trying to explain why the average or the normal actually persists in society. And this is what the functional explanation leads to. The argument that it persists because it must serve some useful purpose. Now, a lot of people have later pointed out the difficulty with the functional explanation, that in a sense it is tautological. It is not an independent explanation. All that it is saying is that because something persists and continues to explain, there must be some useful function. Okay? So it is not the claim, or the explanation is not that there is a function that is being performed, and hence it succeeds. You are arguing from the evidence of persistence or success to say that there must be some useful function that it performs. It is that useful function is not independently established, right? And that is the big problem with functional explanation. The reason why in more recent times in sociological explanation, purely functional explanations are not considered particularly good explanations. Now, normality is difficult to establish in conditions of rapid change. So one of the things that Durkheim is pointing out is that this normal or average is something that must exist over a considerable period of time. It must endure in some state of permanence, something that keeps changing very rapidly. There is nothing normal there. You cannot establish normality. So, for instance, even something like suicide rates, if in a particular place, the suicide rate actually varies, fluctuates a great deal from year to year, then you cannot claim any normal rate of suicide in that case, right? And so it is not something a sociologist will be able to explain. There's nothing there to explain because you cannot pin down the fact, okay? Normality is difficult to establish in conditions of rapid change. For example, and this is an example that Durkheim himself is offering, the weakening of religious beliefs in modern European society of Durkheim's time by the late 19th century. The old kind of religious beliefs are rapidly going away. Now, is it pathological? For instance, those who believe in the religious precepts would say this is a condition of sickness of society, that people are no longer believers. But there are others who would claim, well, this is a new secular norm that is being established. Religion is an expression of an old kind of society. That old kind of society has disappeared. In this new industrial society, secularity is the new norm. That is the average. And so religious beliefs will not be there. Now, which is true. And Durkheim's argument is that in this kind of period of rapid change, it is difficult to establish normality. You cannot claim, the sociologists cannot define either this or that as normal. A social fact is normal for a given social type at its particular stage of evolution. So Durkheim is not denying that the facts can change, but the facts change over a long period of time. They change slowly. Periods of rapid change, you cannot establish the facts. Okay, that is Durkheim's key suggestion. And he goes into a fairly detailed discussion in this chapter, I think it's chapter 3, that I asked you to read, which is the example of crime. Attempting to eliminate all crime is impossible and not entirely desirable. This is a very interesting claim that he's making. Crime in a society is normal. Okay? Crime is necessary and useful. The criminal plays a normal role in society. Okay? Why is Durkheim saying this? Various reasons. One, it is impossible to eliminate crime. So, in a sense, every society has to live with the possibility that some people in society will violate the norms or rules. Okay? And if they violate norms or rules, they will be punished. Right? In fact, methodologically, Durkheim says that if you try to look at crime, establish the facts of crime in a society, what will you look at? How would you identify what is crime or not? He says, look at punishment, the laws. What are the acts that are punished? Those are crimes. Okay? Now, you will find every society will have laws which prohibit or punish certain kinds of acts which are considered criminal. His argument is that a certain normal level of crime exists in every society. That normal level of crime is there. They are caught, criminals are caught, they are punished. And the function is not to cure or eliminate crime. No one ever claims or hopes that by punishing crime, all crime will be eliminated. That is not the function. The function is affirming the social norm. That because norms are violated from time to time by some people, right? Those norms are affirmed by the act of punishment. Because society is then able to identify the criminal and punish, norms get affirmed. We will look at this at much greater length in detail when we read Foucault on discipline and punish. But Durkheim's claim here is actually, the idea of crime as normal, right? As punishment. Again, he is offering a functional explanation that crime has a certain function in society. And that function is to affirm the social norms. And its effect is, paradoxically, to actually help in the solidarity of society by repeatedly and continuously identifying those people who violate the rules of society and are punished by society. That has the function of continuously reaffirming those norms of society. That is the function that Durkheim is suggesting crime plays. Norms change slowly with changes in social structure and debates over the desirability of particular norms. So the examples, for instance, European society, something like blasphemy. In many European societies, there are still laws against blasphemy. That is to say, saying things against the Christian religion, for instance. But there is almost no prosecution anymore. So statements which, let's say, 200 or 300 years ago would have been considered blasphemous are no longer considered blasphemous. That is because that norm has changed, because of changes in the social structure. Homosexuality is another example. For instance, as we know, in many countries of the world, homosexuality is now accepted as normal, and is increasingly becoming more and more acceptable. We know in India, for instance, the attempts to overturn the specific law against homosexuality, which existed from colonial times. But again, don't forget what Durkheim was saying, that they change slowly. Okay, caste discrimination, we can think of lots of things which, for instance, would have been acceptable practices of caste discrimination 50 or 100 years ago, but are no longer considered acceptable. Although it is true, completely, we all understand that caste discrimination continues. But the specific practices have changed. New laws do not necessarily change practices. On the other hand, changes in practice sometimes make existing laws inoperative. And you can look at any of those things, for instance, blasphemy, homosexuality. I've given you the example of child marriage, for instance, etc. The laws don't necessarily change practices on the ground that quickly. On the other hand, changes in practices often take place even though the laws remain in the books, but are no longer operative. The sociologist must discover the facts on the ground, which are normal in a society at a particular point of time, right? The immediate object of sociology is the normal time. And this is Durkheim's key, you might even say, ideological proposition, although he will deny there's anything ideological about it. This is what science does, he would say. Find out the normal time. What is the average prevailing time? Sociology's function is to help maintain the normal state and re-establish it if disturbed. Pursuing ideas of the good is outside the domain of sociology. So as a scientific occupation, the sociologist is not to be concerned about what is the good society and how to achieve it. That is a politician's job. That's the activist's job. Okay? The scientist's role, the role of the sociologist as scientist, is that of the doctor, to forestall sickness, and cure it if sickness occurs. All right? And this is very much his key proposition in this particular book, right? What is the sociological discipline as a scientific discipline going to do? And he answers this question. So, is there nothing that sociology does for society? And his argument is yes, the sociologist does exactly what the doctor does, right? Is to cure the pathological and restore normality. Now, of course, there are all sorts of questions that would be raised and have been raised about this position. Is it a conservative position? Does it simply reaffirm existing power structures in society? Okay, because normality, what is average, what prevails, what is more or less enduring, is of course a reflection on existing power structures which have continued over time. Durkheim does not deny that power structures are challenged, that they change, right? all that he is claiming is that it is not the scientist's job to do it. It is not the scientist's job to do it. Now, we can talk about this later, particularly when we come to Weber. We will find that Weber is not necessarily making that kind of question, that kind of position, taking that position. But I'll stop here and take questions.
Any questions? Rajoshi, why don't you start? Any questions? Okay.
Let me put a question to you. Do you find Durkheim's position acceptable? For instance, many of you have studied sociology, that you may be doing or thinking of doing research in sociology. Do you find Durkheim's position acceptable?
Okay, so Partha Aparna has a question.
Yeah.
What would be the difference between social reality and social facts?
Now, for Durkheim, there is no doubt about this. What is real is factual. Okay? Social facts are in fact what exists in reality. He is making a distinction, of course, between science and ideology. The ideological world, or the world or the social world described in ideological terms, is not for him reality, right? They could be ideal, for instance, right? It could be an ideal description. So, and Durkheim speaks a lot about, for instance, the big ideologies at his time. He talks about socialists and the way in which socialists describe the desirability of a society which is more equal, where wealth is more equally distributed, etc., etc. You can have various things, various elements of a socialistic society which were proposed at the time, and socialists actually went out and described society with that vision or purpose in mind, to look for the possibilities in existing society for moving towards a socialistic form of society. So they would talk about the initiatives of workers, for instance, and the various workers' organizations, the kinds of demands that workers are making, which would be very often central to their description. But Durkheim's objection to this was that it is one thing to discover the actual facts of workers' lives or workers' movements, right? But the ideological description, whose purpose is to motivate people to join the movement, okay, in order to bring about that socialistic world, this, Durkheim would insist, is not the sociologist's job. It's not the scientist's job, because the task of motivating people, giving a description of reality in order to emotionally move people into joining a particular movement. This, Durkheim would insist, is an ideological interpretation of the facts. It's an ideological interpretation of the facts. Facts would be colored in a particular way in order to present a particular account of those facts, of that reality, right? And would not be a true description, a true scientific description of reality. This is the key difference that that Durkheim would insist on. Now, this is a question I'm asking. Are you persuaded by Durkheim's answer? In other words, the key question you would have to ask Durkheim is whether or not this particular way of describing reality, which is completely outside of individual conscience, outside completely independent of the observer's own social position, right? The scientist's own social position. Is this feasible? Or is Durkheim's method itself colored by what he is thinking of as the sociologist's independent position? But in actual fact, the sociologist is not necessarily outside of society, is not necessarily independent. If that was the case, then this presumed independence, this presumed distance of the observer to what is being observed, this would not be feasible. So the interesting methodological questions would be, what would be sort of, you might say, even accounting for, even accepting the place of the sociologist within society? Is it still possible to devise methods, techniques for distanced observation of facts? Is that possible? Is some kind of objectivity still possible? Right? And clearly this is important. This is important because, for instance, once you go into survey research and so on, why is it the case that you devise questionnaires and each surveyor is supposed to operate with that same questionnaire and put the questions in exactly the same way so that the responses are comparable? That is a certain kind of objectivity that is being imposed on that method, right? So that it is not colored by subjective considerations. In other words, the way in which the question is put, maybe the language is varied. We all know that this happens in survey research, because very often the question, if one is doing survey in India, for instance, the questions are framed in English, but it has to be administered in maybe 2, 3, 4 different kinds of languages. What happens in that translation, right? That same distance, if there is a distance, will not be comparable in each of those cases. And then you have a problem of objectivity. So the problem that Durkheim proposes doesn't go away. It's a problem that sociology continues to struggle with and tries to achieve in different kinds of technical ways, right? But Durkheim's basic insistence that facts as things are social reality. That is social reality. Social reality is the same as natural reality. You have to treat it like natural things. Now, that is a position that a lot of sociologists today would find unacceptable, because it's much too simplistic, and simplistic to the extent of being wrong. right? That kind of scientism, 19th century scientism, is usually not advocated anymore.
Partha, there is,
yeah.
Partha, there's another question
Yes.
from Rajoshi Dashgupta.
Yeah.
Sir, I was thinking, when Durkheim speaks about knowing social facts as those that exist beyond individual consciousness, is he also making a tacit claim on the possibility of absolute knowledge? I suppose what he means
No.
is that, yeah.
No, he does not. He is very much, and he says this quite, for instance, something like the reason why he says concepts like state or democracy, these are not subject to proper sociological analysis because they are much too imperfectly defined, right? They are abstract. They cannot be understood as things. There is no thing called democracy. There is no thing called the state. Okay? And what he is suggesting is that can there be no knowledge of the state? Or can there be no knowledge of democracy? Durkheim's position would be, yes, sure, there could be knowledge, but that would not be scientific knowledge. You could have other ways of knowing, or you could claim other ways of knowing democracy or knowing about democracy. But it would not be scientific knowledge, right? And it would not have the same status as knowledge. This is the distinction. He's not saying that science can give us absolute knowledge. He's not even saying that the knowledge of facts that you have will be absolute in any way. Okay, so for instance, he is certainly saying that you can study the family, or you can study religion. As he will say, he will write a whole book on how to on the study of religion. We'll look at it in a couple of weeks. Yes, you can study religion, but you have to define what is religious conceptually in a way that would make it factual. That would make it factual. The knowledge you will get will always be subject to verification. This is standard in any scientific discipline. The knowledge that you get of the facts is provisional, right? It is provisional. New facts will emerge, new explanations may emerge, and they will actually come to replace older explanations, right? They will be better explanations. So there will always be the possibility of a superior knowledge, a better knowledge. But this enterprise is never complete. They will, in fact, he is clearly taking a position which would say that scientific knowledge in this sense will never give you absolute knowledge. Absolute knowledge in that sense would be more of a religious idea. Knowledge of God is absolute, etc., etc. You've had many sort of philosophical conceptions of some sort of absolute knowledge. That is not something science will ever claim to do.
Okay. Are there any questions? Any more questions? Please unmute please unmute yourselves and ask the question. Partha, I don't think there are any more questions.
So next week we will read Weber on the Protestant ethic.
Yeah. I had a question. May I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Okay. This is a question, Partha, that has kind of stayed with me since I first read the elementary forms of religious life.
Yeah.
If we look at Max Weber and Émile Durkheim, both of them kind of became canonical to sociology as well as to anthropology. And even though fieldwork and the field became very central to anthropological methodology, in the conventional sense, neither Durkheim nor Max Weber were field researchers, right?
Yeah.
And if we see if we observe the kind of evidence that Durkheim is using, say in his Rules of Sociological Method or Suicide, his early works like Suicide, and then if we look on to a more mature work like the Elementary Forms of Religious Life, there is a clear shift in the kind of evidence he's using. So if we look at, say, something like the Elementary Forms of Religious Life, and the kind of evidence that he's using a lot of ethnographic reports, lot of travel accounts. How does he does not, reflect on the very discursivity of sociological knowledge? I mean, considering that he's dealing with so many kinds of evidence, but kind of sticking to an idea of objectivity as the key principle throughout his career.
Yes, but you see, one of the key things that he is trying to do in the elementary forms of religious life is, of course, that he is looking at a whole set of observations made not by himself, by lots of other people across centuries, in fact, from very many different religions, including organized religions, established organized religions, as well as from a lot of folk religions, what we otherwise call anthropological studies of supposedly primitive peoples. He is bringing all of that together. Many things which otherwise would have been required, the classic traditional distinction between magic and religion, for instance.
Of course.
Evolution from a state of magic to
religion,
etc. All of that he's taking into account. But where Durkheim is still doing what he's attempting to define here, sociology as a science, is to devise a concept of religion de novo. This concept of religion is not something which is there in the way in which it is practiced. It is a scientific concept. The single definition, right, of the distinction between the sacred and the profane. All religion, anywhere, is about the distinction between the sacred and the profane. Now, this is his discovery. He would say this is like discovering the law of gravity or something like that, right? Which will include everything that we have been used to thinking of as religion or religious practice. Everything can be subsumed under this one single conceptual definition. Once you've done that, then you can classify, subdivide, different forms, all the distinctions between magic, religion, organized religion, etc. You can bring all of that in, but under this single conceptual discovery of a fact. In fact, this is what he would say is the fact of religion, that every religious practice or belief is about the separation of the sacred from the profane. So that is what he would be doing. And we will see why this is quite different from the way Weber, for instance, would look at something like the Protestant ethic, which is, and of course his sociology of religion, which is a series of things that he later tries to do, is not to find this one single concept, like discovering some basic elements in of all matter, etc., etc. That's not what a lot of sociology later would try to do.
Okay, Partha. Any more questions? Okay, Partha, thank you very much. I'll
Thank
see
you.
you soon. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll meet next week
Next
and
Tuesday,
read,
yes.
yeah, read Max Weber's Protestant Ethic.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.